Vivid verses.
The first time I saw it written down, I thought it was a typo. She'd left her tablet open on the kitchen island, a delivery confirmation on screen, and the recipient line read Marin Holloway Kane. I was rinsing a glass at the sink when I noticed it, and I held the glass under the tap a beat longer than I needed to, watching the water run clear over my hand while my mind did the small administrative work of cataloging what I'd just seen. Holloway is my name. She has her own. I set the glass on the drying rack. I dried my hands on the towel that hung from the oven door, the one she bought because it matched the runner on the island, and I walked past the tablet without picking it up. In the front room, I sat down with the book I'd been reading, and I opened it to the page I'd marked, and for about 20 minutes, I read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word. A typo. People do that. Autofill on a form, a careless thumb, a small thing. But I am, by nature and by training, a man who notices small things. And I have learned over a long career that small things are almost never small. Small things are the visible portion of larger structures. A hairline crack in a ceiling is not a crack. It is the lower edge of whatever is happening above it. A misspelled name on a delivery slip is not a typo. It is the surface of an intention. I did not say anything to her about it that night. We had dinner. She'd made the lemon chicken thing she does well, and we ate at the counter because the dining table had her swatches on it. And she talked about her sister's new puppy and about a podcast she'd started, and I listened and laughed in the right places and asked the questions a man asks when his attention is on the conversation. Some part of my attention was, in fact, on the conversation. Another part was sitting back from it, as it had been sitting back from a number of things lately, watching. I am not proud of the watching. It is not how I prefer to live. But there had been a slow accumulation over the months of moments that didn't quite settle. The way she introduced me at her cousin's barbecue. This is my partner. And then, when the cousin's husband leaned in to shake my hand, the slight, almost imperceptible upward tilt at the end of the word, so it sounded less like a noun and more like the first half of one. The way the new neighbors, the couple from down the road who'd come over for drinks, had referred to her twice as Mrs. Holloway, and she had not corrected them, and I had not corrected them either because correcting strangers about a woman's name in front of her felt like a correction of her, which I would not do in front of company. I had filed those moments away in the way that I file things without conclusions attached. Single observations are not patterns. 2 observations are not patterns. 3 is the beginning of one. The tablet was the 4th. I went to bed that night and slept the way I always sleep, which is well. And in the morning, I made coffee for both of us, and I kissed the top of her head where she sat with her phone, and I went about my day as I would go about any other day. I had decided, somewhere between the sink and the front room, that I was not going to confront her. Not yet. Confrontation is a tool, and like any tool, it has a correct moment. The correct moment is when you have enough information to make the confrontation conclusive, when there is nothing the other person can say that will change the shape of what you already know. Anything earlier than that is just an argument, and an argument can be talked around. I did not want to be talked around. I wanted to know what was actually happening. So I waited, and I watched. The next thing I noticed was the post. We have one of those wall-mounted boxes by the front door, the kind with a hinged lid, and she has over the years taken on the habit of bringing the post in herself and stacking it on the corner of the kitchen island for me to sort through in the evenings. It is a kind thing. I had never thought twice about it. Now I thought about it. That weekend, on the Saturday, I was up earlier than her. She'd had wine the night before with her friend from yoga and was sleeping in, and I went out to the box myself. There were 4 envelopes. 2 were for me. One was a charity solicitation addressed to the occupier, and one was a letter from a credit reference agency with a clear plastic window through which I could read the name of the recipient. M. Holloway Kane. I stood at my own front door in my own dressing gown, holding an envelope addressed to a person who did not exist, and I felt the thing inside me that I had been waiting to feel, a kind of quiet click like a tumbler dropping into place in a lock. Not anger. Anger is a wasted response. Anger announces itself. And once you've announced yourself, you've given up your one real advantage, which is that the other party doesn't yet know you've understood the situation. What I felt was clarity. I took all 4 envelopes inside. I put the 2 addressed to me on the island. I put the charity letter in the recycling. The 4th one I held for a long moment, and then I did something I had never done before in our home. I took it into my study, I shut the door, and I opened it. It was, as I'd suspected, a routine notification. A credit reference summary, the kind that gets generated when an account is opened or modified. The associated address was ours. The associated name was the hyphenated one. The letter informed me in cheerful corporate prose, a balance, and a recent inquiry, and a note about a co-applicant credit profile that had been linked to the file. The co-applicant was me. My full name, my date of birth, my everything. I read it twice. Then I put the letter back in its envelope, and I put the envelope in the locked drawer of my desk where I keep the passport and the deed, and I sat in the chair for perhaps a full minute, looking at the window and at the garden beyond the window and at the small gray cat from next door who was, as he often was, sitting on our garden wall, washing his face with one paw. A great deal of what I do, professionally and personally, depends on my ability to know the difference between what a thing is and what a thing looks like. The letter looked like a piece of paperwork. The thing it was an attempted appropriation of a name, of an address, of a credit history I had spent 30 years building one careful brick at a time. She had taken my surname without asking, without telling, without any of the conversations a person has when they intend something of that scale, and she had attached it to her own, and she had gone out into the institutional world of contracts and credit lines and vendor accounts and begun establishing a record under the joint name. With me sitting next to her at dinner, every night, none the wiser. Or so she believed. I sat in the chair, and I did not feel angry. I did not even feel particularly betrayed in the romantic sense, though the betrayal was certainly present. What I felt was the cool, clean alertness of a man who has finally been given the missing piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was assembling. I stood up. I put the kettle on for tea. I went upstairs to take her a cup, because it was, after all, Saturday, and she would expect one. And when she opened her eyes and smiled at me from her side of the bed and said, "Thank you, love," I smiled back, and I sat on the edge of the mattress and I asked her how she'd slept. You learn nothing from a person who knows they're being studied. Over the following 10 days, I conducted what I privately thought of as an inventory. I do not, as a rule, snoop. I have never read her messages. I have never opened her laptop. I am of the unfashionable view that a person's private correspondence is private, full stop, and that a relationship which requires surveillance has already failed in some essential way. So I did not snoop. What I did was something different and, I would argue, more honest. I went looking in my own records for any place where her behavior had touched mine. I started with the joint accounts of which we had, by mutual agreement, exactly 2, a current account for shared expenses and a savings vehicle for the holiday fund. Both showed nothing untoward. The shared current account had her usual standing orders going in and her usual share of the bills going out. The savings account had grown by a modest amount each month and had not been touched. Good. I moved to my own accounts, which I keep separate as she keeps hers, and which I check weekly out of habit. There was nothing on them that should not have been on them. Good. Then I moved to the soft tissue of modern life, the dozens of small recurring relationships a person maintains with vendors and platforms and services, and there I began to find things. The streaming service we shared had been re-registered 3 months earlier under a new primary holder. The primary holder was M. Holloway Kane. The billing card was hers, which I had known and approved but the name on the account was now the hybrid one with my address. A small thing, but a small thing of a particular kind. The grocery delivery account, which I'd set up years ago and to which she'd been added as an authorized user, had been promoted somehow on her end to a co-account, and the salutation on the most recent confirmation email, which had, I now noticed, been quietly forwarded to a new address she had created and added to the account profile, read Dear Mr. and Mrs. Holloway Kane. I sat with that one for a moment. Mr. I'd been silently re-credentialed on a grocery account. The home insurance, which was in my sole name and which I had renewed without thinking 3 months prior, had a secondary policyholder added in the renewal documents. Holloway Kane, M. I'd signed it. Of course I had signed it. She had handed me the renewal one evening over the kitchen island and said, "Just need your signature. Love, I've gone through it." And I had signed it because we were partners and because she was a careful woman about paperwork, or so I had believed, and because the document was 30 pages of dense and I was tired. I had a clear and unwelcome memory of doing so. A man can be careful about 1,000 things, and a single moment of trust is enough to undo him. This is not a complaint. It is a fact about the architecture of trust, which is binary and fragile. You either extend it or you do not. And once you have extended it, the cost of every act of trust you subsequently take is whatever the trusted party chooses to make of it. I made notes. I am a man who makes notes. I keep them in a hardback notebook with a stitched binding, and I number the pages, and I date the entries. By the end of the 10 days, I had 11 separate entries, each documenting a distinct act of administrative misrepresentation, with the relevant document scanned and saved to a folder on a drive that lived only in my study and only on a machine that only I knew the password to. 11 entries. The savings account untouched and the current account clean, but 11 separate places in the institutional fabric of my life where she had quietly stitched her addition to my surname. None, taken alone, would have moved me. Together, they were a project. They had been undertaken with patience, over what looked like at least 6 months, and the trajectory of them was unmistakable. She was building at the level of records and registrations and small bureaucratic confirmations, a documentary record of marriage that had not happened. She was establishing herself in writing as my wife. I stood at the window of my study one evening and watched her in the back garden, deadheading the roses, and I thought, what does she imagine the destination of this is? I could think of 2 answers. One was that she imagined, with the soft and slightly delusional logic of a person who has decided how something is going to go, that the records would eventually become the reality. That at some point, perhaps in the next year, perhaps after a particularly nice holiday, perhaps over a particularly good bottle of wine, I would propose, and the answer she would give me would be one she had been quietly rehearsing for on paper for the better part of a year. That when the moment came, the paperwork would have already been done, and the transition to actual marriage would feel, to her, like a tidying up rather than a sea change. The other answer, which I did not enjoy, was that the records were themselves the point. That if anything were to happen to me, anything in the ordinary actuarial sense, there would be, sitting in 11 different filing systems, a record of a Mrs. Holloway Kane at this address, with co-policyholder status on the home insurance and joint authorization on the grocery delivery account, and a credit profile linked to mine. And the tidying up that followed my absence would proceed in a direction substantially more favorable to her than the one my actual will laid out. I did not, in fairness, believe the second answer. She is not, I genuinely think, a person who has thought about my actuarial profile. She has thought about herself, and she has thought about a future she wants, and she has decided to manifest it through the small administrative levers she has access to. That is a more banal motive, and the more banal motive is usually the correct one. People are not, in my experience, malevolent. They are, however, often willing to hurt other people quite badly in pursuit of what they believe is a reasonable hope. Whichever it was, the response was the same. The trigger, when it came, was almost comical in its banality. I was at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon, working through a backlog, when an email came in from a vendor I'd been doing business with for some years, a supplier of certain professional materials, with whom I had a long-standing account. The email was a CC, not a direct message. The field had 3 names on it, 2 of which were colleagues at the vendor, and the from line was a senior account manager I'd dealt with directly perhaps half a dozen times. Subject: account update, congratulations. The body was warm and brief. The senior account manager wrote that he had been delighted to learn, through our recent administrative correspondence, of my recent marriage, and he wished both myself and Mrs. Holloway Kane every happiness. He was writing to confirm that the account had been updated to reflect the new joint authorization, and that Mrs. Holloway Kane's submitted documentation was now on file, and that any further requests on the account could come from either of us. He had copied his colleagues so that they would be aware. He hoped my wife and I would be very happy together. I read it once. I read it twice. I sat back in my chair and I looked at the ceiling for perhaps 15 seconds. Then I smiled, slightly, because the situation had finally produced its own punctuation. There's a moment in any prolonged observation when the thing you have been watching for finally arrives in a form so unambiguous that you no longer need to watch. The email was that moment. She had not only attached her name to mine on a credit profile and a home insurance renewal and a grocery account. She had now, somewhere, submitted documentation. What documentation I did not yet know, but the word was a useful one, to a professional vendor of mine, identifying herself as my wife, and that vendor had updated his records and copied 3 of his colleagues to the news of my non-existent marriage. The misrepresentation had crossed from the domestic into the professional, from the soft tissue of life into the harder tissue of contractual relationships with people who knew me by my name and my reputation. It was no longer something happening within the walls of our home. It was something now sitting in writing on a server at a company I did business with, where it would be assumed by every person who came into contact with my account that I was a married man, and where any future action on the account, any change of address, any modification of terms, anything, would be processed with the assumption that there was a Mrs. Holloway Kane who had standing. Standing. That was the word for it. She had been quietly acquiring standing. I closed the email. I did not reply to it. I opened a fresh document on my screen, and I typed, in the way I draft anything that matters, 3 short headings. 1. Credit agency. 2. Solicitor. 3. Vendor. Under each heading I wrote, in concise sentences, what I needed to say, what I needed to ask for, and what I needed to leave on the record. Then I made the calls. The credit agency took 11 minutes. I had the previous year paid the small annual fee for the more attentive version of their service, the one that gave a customer a direct line to a human being rather than an automated menu, and the human being I reached when I gave my reference number was a woman with a calm voice and the unruffled competence of someone who has had this kind of conversation many times before. I told her without preamble that there had been a misrepresentation made on a credit application linking my profile to a hyphenated name and to a co-applicant relationship I had not authorized, and that I needed the link disputed, the inquiry flagged, and a fraud alert placed on my file, pending investigation. She asked me a series of identifying questions, which I answered. She asked me whether I wished to formally dispute the linked account or whether I wished to begin with a notification of unauthorized use, which were 2 separate procedures with different downstream consequences. I asked her to walk me through the difference. She did, clearly, in about 90 seconds. I chose the formal dispute. She asked whether I wished to pursue the matter as fraud, with the understanding that this would create a referral to the agency's investigations team, or as a misrepresentation, which would resolve more quickly but would not generate the same paper trail. I thought about that one for perhaps 3 seconds. Fraud was the accurate word for what had occurred in the strict legal sense. Misrepresentation was the lighter word, and the lighter word would resolve faster, and resolving faster was on balance what I wanted. I did not, at this moment, need to escalate to investigations. I needed the record corrected and the link severed. I needed the file straightened. The escalation was a card I could keep in my hand for later, if later required it. I chose misrepresentation. She told me she would put the dispute through immediately. She said the linked entry would be flagged within the hour and removed from active reporting within 2 business days, pending the vendor's response to the dispute notification. She gave me a reference number. I wrote it down. I thanked her. I hung up. 11 minutes. The first piece in place. The solicitor took longer because it was a longer conversation and because he wanted properly to understand the situation in full before he advised on it. I had used the same solicitor for about 15 years on personal matters of varying weight, and he was the kind of professional who treated his clients as adults and who did not, in any conversation I had ever had with him, waste my time. I told him what had been happening. I told him what I had found. I told him about the 11 entries in my notebook and about the email I had received that morning from the vendor. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he said, with the slight pause of a man choosing his words, "I see." Then he asked me what outcome I wanted. I had thought about this. The answer was not as obvious as it might appear. There were 3 or 4 directions the situation could go, and the choice between them was, in some sense, the only choice that mattered. I could pursue criminal complaint on the basis of the misrepresentations to financial institutions. I could pursue civil action on the basis of the unauthorized use of my identifying details. I could pursue neither and simply require the corrections to be made and the record straightened with no further action taken. Or I could combine the third option with a clean and final separation from the relationship. I told him I wanted the third option combined with the fourth. I did not want to pursue criminal complaint because the cost of a criminal complaint, in time, in attention, in the slow grinding of the system, would be greater than any conceivable benefit. I did not want to pursue civil action for the same reason, and because civil action requires sustained engagement with the other party's representation, and I had no further interest in sustained engagement. What I wanted was the record corrected, the misrepresentations formally disputed and reversed, and a clean letter from him to her, on his letterhead, communicating the end of the cohabiting relationship and the requirement that she vacate the residence within a defined and reasonable period, with no personal note from me attached. He asked me whether I was sure about the no personal note part. He asked it as a friend asks something rather than as a solicitor, gently, without pushing. He had known me a long time. He had met her twice. He knew the shape of what I was choosing. I told him I was sure. I told him there was nothing left that required my own words. Anything I would say, at this point, would be either an explanation she did not deserve or a recrimination I did not feel. The letter from him would say what needed saying. The corrected paper trail would say the rest. He said, understood. He said he would draft the letter that afternoon. He said he would send me the draft for review by end of day. He said, after a small pause, take care of yourself. I told him I would. I hung up. The third call was the vendor. I had thought about this one most of all, because the vendor was a long-standing professional relationship, and the senior account manager who had sent the email was a man whose competence I respected and whose company I had, on occasion, enjoyed. He had done nothing wrong. He had been imposed upon, as I had been imposed upon, by the same misrepresentation. The call needed to correct the record without humiliating him, because humiliating him would not serve me and would damage a relationship that had value. I called the direct line. He picked up on the second ring. I heard the small upward shift in his voice when he recognized mine. I said, "I appreciate your kind email this morning. I'm calling because there's been a serious misunderstanding. I want to walk you through it before it goes any further into your records." He was quiet, listening. I could hear him quite clearly stop whatever he had been doing. I told him, in measured sentences, that I was not married, that I had not been married, that the documentation submitted on the account was not authorized by me, and that the joint authorization he had recently added would need to be formally rescinded and removed from the account, with the record updated to reflect that the account was, as it had always been, in my sole name. I told him I had already opened a formal misrepresentation dispute through the relevant credit agency, that my solicitor was preparing further correspondence, and that I would follow up our call with a written email so that the correction was on the record in writing. I did not tell him who Marin was. I did not say her name. I did not characterize her conduct. I said, the documentation submitted was not authorized by me, which was the entire and complete truth, and which placed the burden of correction on the documentation rather than on a person. He could draw his own conclusions about the person in his own time, and I trusted him to draw them privately. He took a breath. He said, and to his credit, he said this without any of the defensive throat-clearing a lesser man would have produced, "I am very sorry. I should have verified directly with you before updating the account. That's on me, and I'll have it corrected within the hour, and I'll send you the confirmation in writing with the original misrepresentation flagged on our internal compliance log." I told him I appreciated that. I told him the matter would be closed on my end once the written confirmation arrived. I told him I looked forward to continuing to do business with him in the usual way. He said, "Understood. Thank you for handling this directly with me." I said, "Of course." I hung up. I sat at my desk for perhaps a minute. The whole sequence had taken under 90 minutes. The credit agency dispute was lodged. The solicitor's letter was being drafted. The vendor's record was being corrected. 11 separate entries in my notebook, and across the next 48 hours, every one of them would be either disputed or corrected, with the paper preserved and the record straightened, and not a single raised voice in any of it. I made a fresh cup of tea. I drank it slowly, looking out at the garden. The gray cat was on the wall again. She came home at 6. I was in the front room when she came in with the book I had been reading the night I first saw the tablet. I had picked it up again that afternoon, not from any wish to revisit the moment, but because it was the book that happened to be on the side table and I needed something to do with my hands. She put her bag down in the hall, and she called out, "Love?" And I answered. She came into the front room. She looked at me, and she smiled, and she sat down in the chair opposite mine, the way she always did, with one leg curled up under her and her hand reaching for the throw on the arm. She asked me how my day had been. I told her my day had been productive. She told me about hers, something about a difficult colleague, something about a lunch she'd had with her sister. And I listened, and I made the appropriate small responses, and somewhere around the 7-minute mark she paused, and she looked at me, and she said, "Are you all right? You're quiet." I said, "I'm well, thank you." She held my eyes for a moment longer than she usually did. Whatever instincts she had for the texture of our evenings together had registered something. I could see her trying to identify it. I did not assist her. I said, "There'll be a letter coming for you in the next day or two. From my solicitor. I'd ask you to read it carefully and to be in touch with him directly with any questions rather than with me." She blinked. She said, "What?" I said, "The letter will explain the situation. I'd rather not go over it tonight. I'd ask you to wait for the letter." She said again, "What?" I stood up. I said, "I'm going to make some dinner. There's pasta, if you'd like some, or you can order in. Either is fine." I went into the kitchen. I put a pan of water on. I heard her, after a long moment, get up from the chair and go upstairs. I did not follow her. I did not, in fact, turn my head when she passed the kitchen doorway on her way up. She came down 20 minutes later with her coat and her overnight bag, and she said from the hallway, in a voice I had not heard from her before, flatter, smaller, a little frightened. "I'm going to my sister's tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." I said, "The letter will be there tomorrow. Please read it before we speak." The front door closed behind her. The small click of it was, in its way, the same click I had felt that Saturday morning at the front door with the credit agency envelope in my hand. A tumbler dropping, a lock engaging. I ate a bowl of pasta at the island with a glass of water, and I read 3 more pages of the book. The letter arrived by courier the following afternoon. I did not see her open it. She had not come back to the house. She would not come back to the house, in fact, except on the appointed day with movers. And I learned later from my solicitor that she had retained her own representation by the end of that week, and that all subsequent correspondence had gone through the two of them, in the calm and impersonal language of professionals, with no further direct contact between her and me. That was the arrangement I had wanted. That was the arrangement I got. There was a brief period in the days that followed when I expected I might hear from her despite the instructions in the letter. A phone call, a message, an attempt to find a back channel through a mutual friend. I prepared mentally for each of these. I rehearsed, in the calm way one rehearses, what I would say to a phone that displayed her number, and what I would say to a friend who appeared at my door with a question on her behalf. None of it happened. She read the letter, I think, and recognized in the quality of it that the door was closed in a particular way that did not admit being knocked on. And she did the wise thing, which was to take her grievances and her hopes and her version of the story to people who were not me. I did not know what version of the story she told. I am, on balance, not curious. People have a right to their own narratives, and I have a right not to consume them. What I will say, in the small honesty I owe to my own account of this, is that I felt no triumph. I have read, in books and articles, descriptions of men in situations similar to mine who reported a sense of vindication when the matter was resolved, and I do not recognize the emotion. I felt, instead, a steady and quiet relief, which is a much smaller and cleaner feeling. The relief of a man who has discovered an error in a long calculation and has corrected it, and who can now proceed with the calculation as it should always have been. There was no satisfaction in it. There was only the absence of the prior incorrect arithmetic. There was a trip I had been meaning to take for 2 years. I had postponed it twice. The first time because of work. The second time because she had wanted us to do a different trip together, and I had agreed because that is what one does. The third time, I told myself, would not be a postponement. I left 10 days after she did. I packed light, as I always pack, and I caught a flight on a Tuesday morning, and by the Tuesday evening, I was in a small lodge at the foot of a range of mountains I had been looking at on maps for the better part of a decade. The lodge had wooden floors and a stove and a window that looked out at a slope of pine. I unpacked. I slept 12 hours. The next morning, I started walking. The walking is the thing I will say least about, because it is the thing that belonged most entirely to me, and I have no interest in turning it into description. I walked 4 days. I walked alone. I walked through weather that varied from cold sun to thin rain to one extraordinary afternoon of light through cloud that I will keep privately for the rest of my life. I did not think about her except in the incidental way one thinks about anything that has recently happened, a passing acknowledgement, no weight attached. I did not, in fact, think about much of anything. I walked, and I noticed what I walked through, and the noticing was its own activity. On the 4th day, I went up. The path to the summit was not technical, but it was long, and the last hour of it was the kind of climbing that asks for one's full attention. I gave it. I came over the last rise of stones a little after noon, with the wind in my face, and I stood at the top with my hands in my pockets, and I looked. Below me the world was laid out in the way the world is laid out from the tops of mountains, which is to say in the proper proportions. The lodge was a dot. The forest was a texture. The sky was the largest fact in any direction. I stood there for a long time, not thinking, only looking, and after a while I took out my phone and I framed the photograph and I took it. It was a self-portrait of a sort. I had set the timer and propped the phone on a cairn, and in the image I'm standing with my back not quite to the camera, looking out with the sky behind me and the wind in my hair and the small involuntary smile of a man who has at last gotten where he meant to go. I sent it to my family, the small group of them, my brother, my sister, and two cousins with no caption. The image was its own caption. I came down the mountain. I had a meal at the lodge. I slept. In the morning there were 3 voicemails on my phone. My brother, my sister, my aunt. They had each, separately, called to say much the same thing, that they had received the photograph, and that the man in the photograph had looked, to each of them, well. My sister used the word peaceful. My aunt used the word himself. My brother said, with his usual economy, good photo. You looked right. I called each of them back, in turn, that morning, with a coffee at the window of the lodge, and the slope of pine outside, and the cold, clean light coming in. I told each of them, when they asked, that I was well. I told them I was, in fact, very well. I told them honestly. It was the truth.
Thanks for listening.